Hey everyone, this is Urinary System video number 6, and we're talking about renal physiology. How do nephrons work? In the last video, we talked about glomerular filtration, and when material is filtered out of the bloodstream, it's going to enter into the renal tubule, and that's where the next two processes are involved, tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion. So let's look at those. And just to remind you what those processes are, so tubular reabsorption is when filtrate enters the tube. It's called tubular fluid. This would be the proximal convoluted tubule. In tubular reabsorption, the body reclaims substances from the tubular fluid. So fluid and materials are moving out of the renal tubule across the wall, and the wall is made up of a simple cuboidal epithelium. And eventually it's going to end up back in the bloodstream. So tubular reabsorption is reclaiming stuff from the kidney tubule back into the body. In tubular secretion, it's basically the opposite process. Tubular secretion is movement of materials from capillaries, the peritubular capillaries, for example, surrounding most nephrons, out of the bloodstream into the tubule. Tubular secretion going into the tubule, tubular reabsorption coming out of the tubule. Okay, those are the two main processes. So let's talk about some general information about both of those, and then we'll talk about some specifics as we move along. So generally what's happening in tubular reabsorption is it's an extremely high volume process. You form about 180 liters of filtrate per day in the glomeruli of both of your kidneys, and 179 of that is reclaimed by tubular reabsorption. So like the process of glomerular filtration, it's an extremely high volume process. Where does tubular reabsorption happen? So, as I mentioned, fluid is moving from the tubule lumen back into the bloodstream. The part of the tubule where most of this is happening is in the proximal convoluted tubule. And in order for it to happen, materials have to move across the cells of the wall of the tubule. Okay? Even though it happens mostly in the proximal convoluted tubule, it does continue to happen along the entire length of the renal tubule, and even in the collecting duct as well. Now, this process is going to be moving materials out of the tubule, and for most materials, this requires ATP in order to actively transport stuff out of the renal tubule and into the bloodstream. And the ATP is involved in powering the active transport proteins to move substances out of the renal tubule. So these active transport membrane proteins are moving stuff out. And for example, most of the materials that are moving out are things that the body finds useful, that are, we want to reclaim them and we don't want to lose them in the urine. So for example, glucose is a solute that is readily filtered out of the bloodstream into the filtrate, enters into the tubule, and is completely reabsorbed. Normally, you don't have any glucose present in the urine. So glucose obviously useful. Amino acids also similarly. Okay? So how do they get completely reabsorbed? Well, the cells in the wall of the tubule have specific active transport membrane proteins. They're going to latch onto those solutes and transport them out. They have to be transported across two membranes. So the plasma membrane that's lining the lumen of the tubule, and then it's going to enter into the cell, and then it has to be transported across the outer plasma membrane on the outer side of the wall. Okay? There is selective transport of materials that enter into the filtrate. I'm going to fit this into three categories. There are some molecules that are completely reabsorbed. Glucose and amino acids are a good example of that. Because they're completely reabsorbed, none of them are present in the urine. There are some molecules, solutes, that are partially reabsorbed. Water and ions are good examples of that. They may be almost completely reabsorbed, but not completely. A little bit of those end up in the urine. And there are some substrates, solutes that are not at all reabsorbed. And they enter into the filtrate from the bloodstream, and they pass completely into the urine. Mostly those are waste molecules. The difference between them is solutes that are completely reabsorbed have specific membrane transport proteins that are going to latch onto them and pull them out of the tubular fluid. Substances that are not at all reabsorbed, there is no corresponding transport protein that's going to pull them out of the fluid. Therefore, they flow all the way through. Substances that are partially reabsorbed, the reason why they're partially reabsorbed is because their reabsorption can be modulated to meet the needs of the body. For example, water. If we're dehydrated, we want to absorb more water than if we're fully hydrated. And for certain ions, we want to modulate that. If the levels of certain ions, like sodium, for example, get too low in our bloodstream, we don't want to lose any sodium in the urine. So we're going to try to reclaim as much of that out of the tubular fluid. Okay, so that's kind of a general overview of tubular reabsorption. And just to go through, some substances 100% reabsorbed, not at all found in the urine. Usually these are nutrients or energy type molecules due to specific membrane transporters in the membrane of the cells making up the wall of the tubule. Here's an example for glucose, and this is showing the cell, cuboidal cell on the wall, the proximal convoluted tubule. And by the way, in the, skipping around there, in the wall of the proximal convoluted tubule, the cells have lots of microvilli on their surface, which is good for absorption because they're going to be absorbing lots of molecules and pulling them out of the tubular fluid. So microvilli are good for absorption. But it's also showing the specific case for glucose. Glucose is pulled out of the tubular fluid by a specific transporter. It also transports sodium, which first of all puts it into the cytoplasm of the cell. And then on the outside membrane, there's another transporter that's going to transport her out into the interstitial fluid and eventually into the peritubular capillary. As a result of that, glucose is going to be completely reabsorbed from the tubular fluid, and no glucose will end up in the urine. Okay? Here are some examples of substances that are regulated in their reabsorption. So there are a number of ions that fall in this category: sodium, potassium, bicarbonate, calcium, and water as well. So typically urine will have some of each of these ions and water, but we can modulate how much is reabsorbed according to the needs of the body. How do we modulate them? So that modulation is regulated by hormones. And the hormones are going to act on cells in the tubule or also in the collecting duct. And it's going to make them either more or less efficient at reabsorbing those substances. I'm going to give you a couple examples from this list. One is sodium reabsorption. How is that regulated? The hormone that's involved in regulating sodium reabsorption is aldosterone. The other is water. Water reabsorption is also regulated. And the hormone we're going to use here that's regulating water reabsorption is antidiuretic hormone. Okay? How do these hormones work? All right. So first of all, where is this regulated reabsorption happening? It's distal convoluted tubule, the collecting tubules, and the collecting duct. We're going to focus on regulated reabsorption by cells in the collecting ducts. Okay? Cells in these locations are responsive to hormones, and there's a specific type of cell called the principal cells that we're going to focus in on. All right, and this is just showing a nephron. Here's the glomerulus, proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, collecting tubule, and collecting duct. So we're going to focus on the collecting duct, and the principal cells are scattered in among other cells in the collecting duct. All right, first of all, the example of sodium reabsorption. How is that regulated by the hormone aldosterone? All right, so sodium reabsorption, sodium passes into the filtrate in the glomerular capsule, starts its travel down the nephron renal tubule. Most, by far, of sodium in the tubule is reabsorbed. However, 2% can be modulated. Can we reabsorb 100%, or can we leave it at 98%, and we can afford to lose 2% of sodium in the urine? Well, that depends whether sodium concentration in the bloodstream is at the optimal concentration. If sodium concentration is too low in the bloodstream, we want to reclaim everything from the renal tubule. We don't want to lose any in the urine. If sodium concentration is too high, or if it's just right, we can afford to lose it. All right? So sodium, first of all, most of it is reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule, but then by the time it gets to the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting ducts, then there's fine regulation of how much is reabsorbed. So let's consider the case where we are running low on sodium in the bloodstream. It's below the optimal level. And what that does is it triggers release of the hormone aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. Aldosterone is going to go into the bloodstream, circulate to the kidneys, and it's going to act on these cells, the principal cells in the wall of the collecting duct. What is it going to do to the principal cells? So its action on the principal cells is to cause them to make more sodium channels. More sodium channels are more pathways for sodium to get out of the lumen of the collecting duct back into the body, right? If it stays in the lumen, it's going to travel into the urine and be lost. We don't want that. We're running low on sodium. We want to reclaim it, okay? So how that works is shown here. And here is the collecting duct. Most of the sodium is reabsorbed here, proximal convoluted tubule, some in the loop of Henle, some in the distal convoluted tubule. But by the time we get here, there's a little bit left, and the question is, do we want to reclaim everything or let that little bit keep going into the urine? So if we're low, we want to reclaim everything. How do we do that? Well, aldosterone acts on these cells, principal cells, causing them to make more sodium channels. More sodium channels is basically more, routes, passageways, highways for sodium to leave and get out into the interstitial fluid and back eventually into the bloodstream. Okay? So that's the way aldosterone works to reclaim almost all sodium and not lose any sodium in the urine. If we have excess sodium, we can afford to lose it in the urine, and aldosterone wouldn't come into play, and we wouldn't have so many sodium channels there. All right, so that's how it works for sodium. Let's look at the example of water reabsorption. So water is the most abundant substance that is filtered into the filtrate. What's in the filtrate is mostly water and dissolved solutes. So about 180 liters total filtered per day, and all but about 1.5 liters is reabsorbed. We make about 1.5 liters of urine. And the majority, about 2/3 of the total volume of water that is passes into the filtrate is reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. How? Well, there are specific water channels called aquaporins that are present in the cells in the wall of the proximal convoluted tubule, allowing water to pass out. This reabsorption continues in the loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, collecting tubules, and ducts. By the time it gets to the ducts, however, we can fine-tune how much water is going to end up in the urine. If we're dehydrated, we don't want to lose as much in the urine. We want to reclaim more water. So that's where the hormone, antidiuretic hormone, comes into play. Antidiuretic hormone, like aldosterone, is going to be released, and it's going to act on the principal cells. In the case of antidiuretic hormone, it's released from a different gland, the posterior pituitary, but it's going to go into circulation, circulate to the kidneys, and act on the principal cells. When it gets to the principal cells in the wall of the tubule, antidiuretic hormone is going to do similar to what aldosterone does. It's going to just cause the cell to make a ton of aquaporins. Now this cell is equipped with more passageways out of the lumen and into the bloodstream. We're going to reclaim more water, and we're going to lose less water in the urine. The urine is going to be more concentrated, but there's going to be less volume. That's what we're going to do if we're dehydrated. Okay? All right, I'm going to end this video here. In the next video, I'm going to talk about how blood pH is regulated. See ya.